Okay, so we're going to pick up where we left off, talking about society in the 1950s, and we were talking about the baby boom. The baby boom is a little spike in the birth rate at the right after World War II. For the short term, obviously, it's a huge jump. Alright, so we're talking live births per 1,000 people. At the end of World War II, it's up around 20.5, and that's a big jump up to about 26.5. Alright, that's known as the baby boom. Now, obviously, it's only a short-term thing. Alright, you see, even before we get to the 1950s, it comes down again. And if we look at the long-term trend in the United States is there for there to be fewer and fewer children born. Okay, and the baby boom is like a temporary blip in the birth rate. Baby boom effects. Alright, so the immediate effects in the 1950s is a big surge in the economy in terms of stuff that you have to buy for little babies and kids. Alright, formula, diapers, that kind of thing. Also, there's going to be a lot of schools built to educate these kids. In the 1960s, baby boomers are old enough to go to college, and there's going to be a huge turbulent decade when the baby boomers get to college and question society around them. In the 1970s, as the baby boomers graduate college and try and get jobs, the 1970s sees a tightening of the job market with this increased competition for jobs in conjunction with other world events that put pressures on the US economy. In the 1980s, we have a little spike in the birth rate as baby boomers, some of them have kids, and more recently, as baby boomers have retired, we get the impact on Social Security, a system that when it was first devised in the 1930s, we had a very different society with more younger people than older people. Now, of course, we're having a society where fewer of us are having kids and we're living longer, so there's more older people. 1950s is all about teen culture. It's kind of like the 1920s. Advertising becomes a big deal, especially corporate advertising, sporting events, that kind of thing. Hollywood is important again in the 1950s. But the big thing in the 1950s is the musical phenomenon known as rock and roll. A lot of parallels with the 1920s here. In the 1920s, of course, jazz was the big thing, and jazz, of course, being an African-American musical style that was listened to and danced to by white kids, and their parents weren't that happy about it. In the 1950s, largely coming from African-American rhythm and blues influences, and with some country music influence and bluegrass music, we see the emergence of what one DJ coined as rock and roll. And we have this mixture of African-American entertainers, and by the later 1950s, white entertainers performing the same music, symbolized, of course, by the archetypal white entertainer of rock and roll, Elvis Presley, a man who, in the words of one of the first guys who signed him, was a white kid who sang and danced like a black person. In the 1950s, white middle-class parents are going to be very upset about this musical development, and they are going to be upset with the music that their kids listen to. I mean, that's not at all like I am today. Hold on a second. Hey, turn that rap music down, please. I'm trying to record. Jeez. Yeah, so as I was saying, oh wait. God, I'm just like my parents. I do object to the music my kids listen to. Anyhow. There are a couple of videos that I'm putting on Edline that I want you to watch. In the 1950s, we see some cultural dissent. Most of the story of the 1950s is about middle-class white society, and everyone conforms, and we talked about this in the warm-up. We think of diners and ice cream parlors and poodle skirts and greased back hair and fast cars and that teenage culture. There were a lot of people who didn't like the middle-class white culture. They're called the Beat Generation. These are guys, some of them were poets, some of them appeared in movies. They rejected the mainstream white culture. There's a very definite connection with the 1960s upheavals here, in the sense that the Beat Generation kind of sows the seeds for some of the later social protests that we're going to see in the 1950s. So we've talked a lot. The 1950s in our minds, anyway, at least in my mind, a lot of the 1950s is white, middle class, suburban. That's kind of our popular image of the 1950s, and there is another side to the 1950s. One of the things we see that starts in the 1950s is changing immigration patterns. You can see on the graphs. We go from, if you remember, in the 1920s, we passed laws that basically restricted Southern and Eastern European immigration. Even so, from 1931 to 1960, there's still a lot of immigration from Europe, maybe not Southern and Eastern Europe. After the 1960s, when we've changed some of the laws, what you're going to see is more immigration from Latin America, so we see more Hispanic immigration, and we see a big jump in Asian immigration. So one of the things the SOL focuses on for the post-war period is the changing immigration patterns, where we see more Asian and Hispanic immigration. I want you to look at your notes because I gave you some newspaper adverts from the 1950s. The ideal for women was that they stayed at home, were ideal middle-class moms, but a lot of women did have to work. The problem was, if they did work, it was quote-unquote women's work, and the ads in the newspaper kind of show that. Mainly secretarial work and that kind of thing. In the 1950s, there is a problem in our cities. We have had, since World War I and picking up pace after World War II, increasing suburbanization, people moving away from the cities into the suburbs. A lot of industry is going to move out of cities, and we see the growth of service industries in cities, more lower-paying jobs there. In the suburbs, we see some covert racism where things like housing covenants forbid you to sell your house to someone who isn't a white person, that kind of thing. Now, these are going to be challenged in the court system, but even so, in the 1950s, what we're going to see is de facto segregation with white suburban communities appearing. In the cities themselves, we're going to try to improve this in the late 1950s, early 1960s. We're going to tear down the blighted part of cities, and we're going to build federally funded housing projects. Unfortunately, these housing projects become almost like permanent places where a group, mainly minority people, are going to live. And in the late 1950s, a Swedish sociologist by the name of Gunnar Myrdal termed this group the underclass. So this group, this minority group that lives in these federally funded projects in the cities, are almost permanently not joined with what's going on in the main United States. And in the 1950s, what we're talking about is this economic boom that this group, the underclass, is not a part of. Here is another graph that just shows the effect of suburbanization on the cities, with more and more Americans moving to the suburbs. And you can see by the end of the 1950s, a lot of major US cities in decline. White people left them. Racial discrimination, lack of sympathy for the less fortunate, just leave these cities bereft of any investment. There's also poverty in other areas, poverty in Appalachia, or Appalachia, depending on how you pronounce it. And so we can definitely talk about, quote, another America. All right, so the main vision we have of the 1950s is this white, suburban, doing well economically group of people. But the other America, largely minority groups, a lot of them living in poverty, whether you're talking about Native Americans on reservations, or Hispanic migrant workers, or African Americans in blighted parts of inner cities. 1950s is when we see civil rights really begin to score some major victories. So a little review. Reconstruction ended in 1877. Very quickly, that compromise of 1877 led to segregated society in the South that we refer to as Jim Crow society. Jim Crow society started out as kind of unofficial, but it was given an official rubber stamp in 1896 when the Supreme Court heard the case Plessy versus Ferguson, which was about separate rail cars in Louisiana. The Supreme Court listened to the arguments and said that separate rail cars were not unconstitutional as long as they were equal. The key amendment here is the 14th Amendment, which states that states cannot make laws that take away our rights, and Homer Plessy had argued that his 14th Amendment rights had been violated by the segregated railcar laws. So Jim Crow society grows up under the approval of the government, but it is definitely separate, but definitely not equal. World War I and World War II, a little bit different in the military. In World War I, the military, basically the African Americans who fought in World War I did little more than dig trenches and dig latrines. In World War II, they're still segregated, but African Americans do fight a little bit in World War II, even though they're in segregated units. We're going to see some successes in the 20s, 30s, and 40s of two major groups that fight for change, the Congress for Racial Equality and the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Persons. President Truman is a forward thinker, and actually that's one of the reasons that he becomes less and less popular, is his views on race. He, by executive order, desegregates the armed forces in 1948. And also, as part of his Fair Deal in 1948, proposed civil rights legislation which was opposed by Southerners. And, of course, most famously in the late 1940s, Jackie Robinson broke the color line in baseball. The big breakthrough comes in 1954, and it's a court case that has to do with a little girl. Her last name is Brown, and she has to travel several miles to go to school every morning, and there is a perfectly good school less than a mile from where she lives. The problem is the school that is close to her is all white, and she is black. This case is from Kansas, but there were several other cases that were being heard in state court systems in the early 1950s. These cases are bundled together into one case that the Supreme Court hears, and actually there was a case from Arlington, Virginia that was involved too. The only reason that this case was heard by the Supreme Court is purely the accident of the alphabet. Brown comes before the other names, so the court is going to hear the Kansas case as opposed to the Virginia case or whatever. So the Supreme Court hears this case and overturns Plessy versus Ferguson. Alright, so the doctrine of separate but equal as it applies to schools is overturned. Now, a couple of key people that we need to know. Thurgood Marshall was the lead attorney for Brown versus Board of Education, the lead NAACP attorney. Oliver Hill was the NAACP attorney for the Virginia case. He is going to work with Thurgood Marshall on the Brown v. Board case. The 14th Amendment is still the amendment that's at odds here, that's at issue here, and the Supreme Court basically says that the separate schools do violate the 14th Amendment. And then the Supreme Court is going to do something weird. It tells states that have segregated schools to desegregate them with all deliberate speed. Deliberate is an adjective, in this case, that means carefully, slowly. So the Supreme Court is basically saying, desegregate schools slowly, quickly. In other words, it's a very kind of fuzzy, ambiguous instruction, and not surprisingly, southern states are going to emphasize the deliberately part and go very, very slowly and drag their feet, which means that we get to the 1970s and we still have segregated school districts in certain areas. And you should read, well, I will read the quote from the court case. Segregation of white and colored children in public schools has a detrimental effect upon the colored children. The impact is greater when it has sanction of the law, for the policy of separating the races is usually interpreted as denoting the inferiority of the Negro group. Any language in contrary to this finding is rejected. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. You can see by the picture that that whites in the South were not happy with this, and a senator by the name of Byrd is going to lead the resistance in the South, and the senator called for, quote, massive resistance in the South. This resistance is going to take a variety of forms. Obviously, in the poster, in the picture, you can see the demonstrations with the fear that desegregating schools will permit the mixing of the races. And what we're going to see is white flight. What that means is white people are going to move from neighborhoods that are mixed, and they're going to move into all white neighborhoods so their kids won't have to go to school with African American kids. If you can't afford to move, maybe you can afford to go to a private school. A lot of private schools, especially in the South, are founded in the 50s and the 60s as a result of civil rights being gained by blacks, and obviously the Brown v. Board education decision. See, when we talk about civil rights, we cannot ignore the story of Rosa Parks, who on December 1st, 1955, refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white person, which was the law in the town of Montgomery, Alabama. She was arrested, as you can see by her mugshot. That led to the famous bus boycott led by the NAACP. And, of course, Montgomery, Alabama, their buses relied on African American customers, so that form of economic boycotting was very, very successful, and in 1956 the state Supreme Court overturned that law. Eisenhower plays a very, very kind of weird, ambiguous role here. Eisenhower does not publicly come out and support civil rights. In the cartoon that you see on the right-hand side, this is a cartoon that's critical of Eisenhower, and it's a cartoon that captures a concept called the helicopter presidency, this concept that Eisenhower kind of flew above the issues, and you can see Eisenhower there, he's in the helicopter, and he has this inane grin on his face, as though he's completely unaffected by the stuff that's happening. And there is a variety of issues that you can see, one of which is civil rights. The Montgomery bus boycott is led by someone who is going to emerge as a civil rights leader. All right, that is Martin Luther King. And in 1957, we are going to see a group of religious leaders, including Martin Luther King, come together and form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, of the SCLC. And this is the early focus of the civil rights movement, and what we're focusing on here is desegregating public places, and the South is the early focus of this, getting rid of this Jim Crow, these Jim Crow laws and Jim Crow customs in Southern society. So the early focus, the 1950s focus of civil rights movement is going to be focused on overturning the Jim Crow society in the South. Now, that's important to remember because when we get to the 1960s, the shift of civil rights is going to move, and there comes a point when the shift moves away from correcting the Jim Crow South to addressing the issues that are there in the North but maybe haven't been emphasized up to this point. We have a group called the Little Rock Nine. In September 1957, school board in Little Rock, Arkansas won a court order requiring that 9 African-American students be admitted to Central High, a school with 2,000 white students. The governor of Arkansas was a moderate. However, he was up for re-election, and what better way to get re-elected than defend white supremacy? So he basically is going to be publicly blocking these 9 kids being admitted to this Central High School. And he actually orders troops from the Arkansas National Guard to prevent these students from entering the school. This is the first time since Reconstruction that a southern state had really opposed the federal government like this. And it forces Dwight Eisenhower to act. No more can he ride in his helicopter with his silly grin. And there's a picture, probably one of the most powerful pictures I think I show all year. This young lady, one of the Little Rock Nine, and what always gets me in this picture is the hatred that is seen on this young lady's face right here. So Forbes had used the armed forces of a state to oppose the federal government, the first such challenge to the Constitution since the Civil War and Reconstruction. Eisenhower knew he had to do something, so Eisenhower ordered the army to go to Little Rock, Arkansas. However, officials there will not give in until 1959, and these poor kids basically have to be guarded by the federal government, and they have army, they have soldiers who basically went around with them in their school to protect them. Alright, that's the end of the recording, so please make sure that you watch the YouTube videos about the 50s as well.